Ashes of Yesterday. Chapter 1. The Urn in Her Hands. Margaret Allison stood in her small house in Edinburgh, the quiet of the morning pressing against her like a heavy blanket. In her hands she held the urn that contained the ashes of her husband, Thomas. The urn was not large, but it felt heavy, heavier than its true weight, because it carried the memory of a man she had loved deeply. Margaret was 34 years old, a teacher who had spent her life guiding children through lessons of reading and writing, but now she felt as if she herself had become a student of grief. Her heart was full of questions that no book could answer. She looked at the urn and felt the weight not only in her hands but also in her soul. Thomas had been a painter, a man who saw beauty in places where others saw only ordinary streets or simple landscapes. He had filled their home with colors, with sketches of bridges, gardens, and the sea. Margaret remembered how his eyes lit up when he spoke about light and shadow, how he believed that every place carried a secret story waiting to be painted. Now those stories seemed unfinished, and she felt that her task was to carry them forward in another way. She decided that she would walk through the places that had been important for both of them, places where his art had lived and where their love had grown. She believed that by scattering his ashes in those places, she would honor his memory and perhaps find a path to healing. The urn felt cold against her fingers, and she thought about how strange it was that a life could be reduced to ashes. She remembered Thomas's laughter, his voice, the way he leaned over his canvas with concentration, and she struggled to accept that all of it was gone. Yet she also understood that ashes were not only an end. They were a symbol of transformation, of something that had changed but still remained. She told herself that as long as she carried his memory, Thomas was not truly gone. The urn was heavy, but it was also a guide, leading her to places where she could let go of sorrow piece by piece. Margaret stepped outside, the streets of Edinburgh quiet in the early hour. The city was familiar, yet it felt different now. Every stone, every building seemed to carry echoes of her past with Thomas. She thought about the bridge where he had painted, the sea where they had walked, the gardens where they had sat together. Each place was a chapter of their life, and now each place would become a chapter of her farewell. She felt fear, because she did not know if scattering the ashes would bring peace or more pain. But she also felt determination. She knew that grief was not something to escape. It was something to walk through, step by step, until it became part of her strength. As she held the urn close, Margaret realized that this journey was not only about Thomas. It was also about herself. She had lived in his light, supported his art, and shared his dreams, but now she had to find her own way forward. She understood that walking through the places of their past would help her see that love did not end with death. It changed, it became memory, and memory could guide her toward healing. She whispered to herself that she was ready. The urn in her hands was heavy, but her heart was stronger than she had believed. She would carry both the ashes and the memories, and she would begin the journey that grief demanded. Margaret held the urn with her husband's ashes. She felt the weight not only in her hands but also in her heart. She decided to walk through the places that had been important for both of them, knowing that each step would bring her closer to understanding sorrow and closer to finding peace. The urn was not only a vessel of ashes. It was a vessel of love, memory, and transformation, and Margaret was ready to follow where it led. Chapter 2. The Old Bridge. Margaret Allison walked slowly through the streets of Edinburgh, the urn held close against her chest. The morning air was cool, and the sound of her footsteps echoed softly on the cobblestones. She had chosen her path carefully, for this was the first place where she would let the ashes of Thomas return to the world. The old bridge stood ahead of her, its stones worn smooth by centuries of rain and footsteps. It was not a grand bridge, but it carried a quiet dignity, and for Thomas it had always been a place of inspiration. He had painted it many times, capturing the way the light touched the stones, the way shadows stretched across the water, and the way the city seemed to breathe around it. As Margaret reached the bridge, memories rose in her mind with sharp clarity. She remembered standing beside Thomas as he worked, watching his brush move across the canvas with patience and care. He had often told her that the bridge was more than stone and mortar. To him it was a symbol of connection, a place where the past and present met, where people crossed from one side of life to another. Margaret had never thought much about it then, but now, standing alone, she understood what he had meant. The bridge was not only a structure. It was a reminder that life itself was a crossing, and grief was part of that journey. She placed her hand on the cold stone railing and felt the rough texture beneath her fingers. The urn seemed heavier than before, as if it knew the importance of this moment. Margaret opened it carefully and let a small part of the ashes fall into the wind. The particles drifted gently, carried across the water, disappearing into the air. She watched them scatter and felt a strange peace. It was as if Thomas's spirit was moving freely again, no longer bound by the silence of the urn. The act did not erase her sorrow, but it softened it, turning pain into memory. Margaret thought about how grief had shaped her since Thomas's death. At first it had been only pain, sharp and endless, pressing against her every hour. But now, standing on the bridge, she realized that grief was also memory. It was the way she remembered his laughter, the way she recalled his paintings, the way she felt his presence in places he had loved. Grief was not only a wound. It was also a way of keeping beauty alive. She understood that every place she visited would remind her of Thomas, but it would also remind her of the joy they had shared. The river below the bridge flowed steadily, carrying water toward the sea. Margaret watched it and thought about how life moved in the same way. It carried everything forward, even sorrow, even love. She realized that she could not hold on to the past forever. She had to let it flow, just as the ashes flowed into the air and the river. She whispered silently to herself that Thomas would always be part of her, but she must continue walking. The bridge had taught her that grief was not only pain but also memory of beauty, and beauty could guide her toward healing. Margaret stood for a long time on the old bridge, the urn still in her hands, her heart lighter than before. She knew that this was only the beginning of her journey, but she also knew that each step would bring her closer to peace. The bridge had given her a lesson, one that Thomas had always tried to show her through his art. Life was fragile, but it was also full of beauty, and even in sorrow there could be light. She turned away from the bridge, ready to continue her path, carrying both the ashes and the memories with her. Chapter 3. The House by the Sea. Margaret Allison traveled from the city to the coast, carrying the urn close to her chest as if it were a fragile treasure. The road was long, and the air grew sharper as she approached the sea. She had chosen this place because it was one of the most meaningful in her life with Thomas. They had often walked along the shore together, listening to the waves and watching the horizon stretch endlessly before them. For Thomas, the sea had always been a source of inspiration. He had painted it in every season, capturing the restless movement of the water and the quiet strength of the cliffs. For Margaret, the sea had been a place of peace, a reminder that life was vast and full of mystery. Now, as she stood before it alone, she felt both comfort and sorrow. The house by the sea was small and weathered, built of stone and wood that had endured many storms. It had once belonged to Thomas's uncle, and they had spent summers there, away from the noise of the city. Margaret remembered the evenings when Thomas would sit outside with his canvas, painting until the light faded, while she read quietly beside him. She remembered the mornings when they walked barefoot on the sand, speaking little but feeling close in the silence. The house had been a place where their love had grown stronger, where they had shared simple joys that now seemed priceless. Standing before it, Margaret felt the weight of memory pressing against her heart. She carried the urn down to the shore, the wind tugging at her coat and hair. The sea roared with its eternal rhythm, waves breaking against the rocks, foam rising and falling. Margaret opened the urn carefully and let part of the ashes fall into the wind. They scattered quickly, carried out over the water, disappearing into the vastness of the sea. She watched them drift away and felt a release inside her. It was as if part of her sorrow had been lifted, carried off with the ashes, leaving her lighter than before. She realized that grief was not only about holding on. It was also about letting go, allowing the past to move into the world and become part of something larger. Margaret thought about Thomas as she stood on the shore. She remembered his laughter when the waves splashed against them, his quiet concentration when he painted, and his joy in simple things like the smell of salt in the air or the cry of seabirds overhead. She realized that these memories were not chains but gifts. They reminded her that love did not end with death. It changed form, becoming part of the world around her. The sea carried his ashes, but it also carried his spirit, his art, and his presence. She felt that he was still with her, not in body but in memory, and memory was strong enough to guide her forward. The house by the sea stood behind her, silent and enduring, a witness to their past. Margaret understood that she could not live in that past forever. She had to move forward, carrying the lessons of love and loss with her. The wind had taken part of the ashes, and with them part of her sorrow. She felt that each place she visited would help her release more of the pain, until grief became not a burden but a path to healing. She turned away from the sea, the urn still in her hands, ready to continue her journey. The house by the sea had given her strength, reminding her that sorrow could be transformed into memory, and memory could become a source of peace. Margaret walked back slowly, the sound of the waves fading behind her. She knew that her journey was far from over, but she also knew that she had taken another step toward healing. The sea had taught her that life was vast, that sorrow could be carried away by the wind, and that love could remain even when the body was gone. She held the urn close, but her heart felt lighter. The house by the sea had shown her that grief was not only pain but also memory of beauty, and beauty could guide her through the darkness. Chapter 4. The Garden in Edinburgh. Margaret Allison walked through the familiar streets of Edinburgh, the urn still held close to her chest. The city was alive with its usual rhythm, but for her every step carried the weight of memory. She had chosen the garden as her next place because it had been one of the quiet corners where she and Thomas had often sat together. It was not a grand garden, but it was full of life, with flowers that changed with the seasons and benches where people rested. For Thomas, it had been a place to sketch, to capture the way light fell across leaves and the way shadows stretched across the paths. For Margaret, it had been a place of calm, where she could sit beside him and feel the peace of shared silence. When she entered the garden, she felt the air shift. The scent of earth and flowers surrounded her, and the sound of children playing reached her ears. She stopped for a moment, watching them run across the grass, their laughter rising like music. The sight touched her deeply. She remembered how she and Thomas had once sat on the same benches, watching families pass by, imagining their own future together. That future had been cut short, but the garden reminded her that life did not stop with loss. It continued, full of movement and joy, even when the heart was broken. Margaret sat down on one of the benches, the urn resting beside her. She thought about how grief had changed her. At first it had made her feel separate from the world, as if she were walking in shadows while others lived in light. But now, in the garden, she saw that sorrow was not the end of life. It was part of it, woven into the same fabric as joy. The children playing reminded her that the world carried on, that laughter could exist beside tears, and that healing was found not in forgetting but in learning to live with memory. She opened the urn and let a small part of the ashes fall into the soil near the flowers. The wind carried them gently, mixing them with the earth. Margaret felt that Thomas was becoming part of the garden, part of the life that grew there. She imagined that his spirit would live in the colors of the flowers, in the laughter of the children, and in the quiet peace of the benches. The act did not erase her pain, but it gave her comfort. It showed her that love could continue in different forms, that memory could become part of the living world. Margaret stayed in the garden for a long time, watching the children, listening to the wind, and feeling the warmth of the sun. She realized that grief had taught her something important. It had shown her that life was fragile, but it was also strong. Even when the heart was broken, life continued, carrying both sorrow and joy together. She understood that she could not stop the pain, but she could choose to walk with it, to let it guide her toward compassion and strength. The garden had given her a lesson, one that Thomas had always tried to show her through his art. Beauty was found not only in perfection but also in the simple moments of life. When she finally stood up to leave, Margaret felt lighter. The urn was still in her hands, but her heart carried more peace than before. She knew that her journey was not finished, but she also knew that each place she visited brought her closer to healing. The garden in Edinburgh had reminded her that life continued even when the heart was broken, and that memory could be transformed into hope. She walked out of the garden slowly, ready to take the next step, carrying both sorrow and strength within her. Chapter 5. Arthur's Seat. Margaret Allison began her climb up Arthur's Seat early in the morning, the urn held carefully in her hands. The sky was pale, and the air was cool, carrying the scent of grass and stone. She had chosen this place because it was one of the highest points in Edinburgh, a place where she and Thomas had often walked together. For Thomas, the mountain had been a source of inspiration. He had loved the way the city stretched below, the way the horizon seemed endless, and the way the light changed with every passing hour. For Margaret, it had been a place of quiet strength, where she felt small but also connected to something greater. Now, climbing alone, she felt the weight of grief but also the promise of peace waiting at the top. The path was steep, and Margaret's steps were slow, but she did not rush. Each step felt like part of her journey, part of the process of carrying sorrow upward until it could be released. She thought about Thomas as she climbed, remembering his laughter when the wind pushed against them, his calm voice when he spoke about the beauty of the view, and his joy in painting the landscape from different angles. She realized that he had always seen the mountain as more than a place. For him, it was a symbol of endurance, of standing tall against time and weather. Margaret understood that now. She felt that climbing Arthur's Seat was not only about scattering ashes. It was about finding strength in herself, strength that Thomas had once shown her. When she reached the top, the city of Edinburgh lay below her, quiet and distant. The rooftops stretched across the land, the river shimmered in the light, and the hills rolled gently beyond. Margaret stood still, holding the urn, and felt the wind surround her. It was strong but not harsh, carrying with it a sense of freedom. She opened the urn and let part of the ashes fall into the air. The wind caught them quickly, lifting them high, scattering them across the sky. She watched them drift away and felt a deep release. It was as if Thomas was becoming part of the horizon, part of the air, part of the strength of the mountain itself. Margaret closed her eyes and thought about what this moment meant. She realized that her husband would always be part of her, not only in memory but in the way he had shaped her life. His love had given her courage, his art had taught her to see beauty, and his presence had shown her the value of simple moments. She understood that grief would remain, but it did not have to hold her back. It could become part of her strength, part of the way she moved forward. Standing on the mountain, she felt that she was not alone. She carried Thomas with her, but she also carried herself, her own will to live and to continue. The view from Arthur's Seat reminded her that life was wide and full of possibility. She thought about her students, about the lessons she still wanted to teach, about the paths she had yet to walk. She realized that moving forward did not mean forgetting. It meant living with memory, allowing it to guide her without controlling her. The mountain had given her a lesson, one that Thomas had always tried to show her through his art. Strength was not found in denying sorrow but in carrying it with dignity. Margaret turned away from the horizon, the urn still in her hands, her heart steadier than before. She had felt strength on the mountain top, and she knew that she must move forward, carrying both love and loss as part of her journey. Margaret walked down slowly, the wind still brushing against her face, the city waiting below. She felt lighter, not because the grief was gone, but because she had accepted it. Arthur's Seat had shown her that sorrow could be transformed into strength, and strength could guide her toward healing. She understood that her husband would always be part of her, but she also knew that she must continue to live, to teach, to walk her own path. The mountain had given her courage, and she carried it with her as she descended, ready for the steps that lay ahead. Chapter 6. The Old Theatre. Margaret Allison walked through the streets of Edinburgh until she reached the Old Theatre, a building that had stood for generations with its stone walls and tall windows. The theatre had always been a place of joy for her and Thomas. They had spent many evenings there, sitting side by side, watching plays that filled their hearts with laughter, sadness, and wonder. For Thomas, the theater had been more than entertainment. He had loved the way the actors used light and shadow, the way the stage transformed into different worlds, and the way stories could touch the soul. For Margaret, it had been a place where she felt close to him, sharing the same emotions, breathing the same air, and living the same story together. Now, as she entered alone, she felt the weight of memory pressing against her, but she also felt a quiet strength rising inside her. The theater was dim, with dust floating in the air and the faint smell of wood and velvet lingering from years past. Margaret walked slowly down the aisle, her steps echoing softly against the floor. She remembered how Thomas had once leaned forward in excitement during a performance, his eyes shining as if he were part of the play itself. She remembered how he had sketched scenes from memory afterward, capturing the movement of actors and the glow of lanterns. Those memories came alive as she stood in the empty hall, and for a moment she felt as if he were still beside her. The pain of loss was sharp, but it was softened by the joy of remembering how much they had shared. Margaret carried the urn carefully, her hands steady. She opened it and let a small part of the ashes fall near the stage. The particles drifted down, settling quietly, becoming part of the place that had once brought them happiness. She felt that Thomas was joining the theater again, not as a spectator but as part of its spirit. The act gave her comfort, because it reminded her that love did not disappear with death. It remained in the places where it had lived, in the memories that carried both sorrow and joy. She realized that grief was not only about pain. It was also about remembering beauty, and beauty could heal. As she stood in the theater, Margaret thought about her own life. She had always been a teacher, guiding children through lessons, but she had also been a student of Thomas's art and passion. He had taught her to see the world differently, to notice details, to value stories. She understood now that his lessons were not gone. They were part of her, shaping the way she lived and the way she would continue to live. The theater reminded her that stories had power, that they could carry people through darkness and bring them into light. She felt that her own story was still being written, and that Thomas's presence would remain in its pages. Margaret stayed for a long time, sitting in the quiet hall, listening to the silence that seemed full of echoes. She realized that the theater was not empty. It was alive with memory, alive with the joy of past evenings, alive with the lessons of love and art. She felt peace as she stood to leave, the urn still in her hands but her heart lighter than before. The old theater had shown her that grief could bring both pain and joy, and that joy was not something to fear. It was a gift, a reminder that love had been real and strong. Margaret walked out into the evening air, ready to continue her journey, carrying both sorrow and joy together as part of her healing. Chapter 7. The Last Path. Margaret Allison walked slowly through the quiet streets of Edinburgh, the urn held close to her chest. The air was heavy with silence, and the sky carried the soft gray of late afternoon. She knew that this was the final step of her journey, the place where she would scatter the last of Thomas's ashes. The cemetery lay ahead, a place where generations of her family had been buried, where the stones stood as markers of lives once lived. For Margaret, it was not only a place of sorrow but also of connection. She had visited it many times as a child, walking with her parents, listening to stories about ancestors who had lived with courage and dignity. Now she came alone, carrying the ashes of her husband, ready to join his memory with theirs. The cemetery was quiet, with rows of old stones leaning slightly from years of wind and rain. Margaret walked among them, her steps slow and careful, her heart heavy but steady. She thought about Thomas as she moved forward, remembering his laughter, his art, and his love for simple beauty. She realized that bringing him here was not only about ending her journey. It was about placing him among the roots of her own life, among the people who had shaped her family and her history. She felt that this act would give her peace, because it would connect his memory to something larger than herself. Margaret reached the place where her ancestors rested, a small corner of the cemetery marked by stones worn smooth with age. She stood there quietly, holding the urn, and felt the weight of the moment. She opened it carefully and let the last of the ashes fall to the ground. The wind carried some into the air, while the rest settled gently among the grass and soil. She watched them disappear and felt a deep release inside her. It was as if the journey she had carried for so long had finally reached its end. The ashes were no longer a burden in her hands. They had become part of the earth, part of the place where memory and history lived together. As she stood in silence, Margaret thought about what she had learned through her journey. She realized that grief was not only pain. It was also a teacher, showing her the value of memory, the strength of love, and the importance of letting go. She understood that Thomas would always be part of her, not only in the places they had shared but also in the lessons he had left behind. His art had taught her to see beauty in the ordinary, his love had taught her to find courage in sorrow, and his presence had taught her that life was fragile but meaningful. She felt that scattering the ashes was not about saying goodbye. It was about accepting that love could continue in memory, and memory could guide her forward. Margaret stayed for a long time in the cemetery, listening to the wind move through the trees, watching the light fade across the stones. She felt calm, not because the pain was gone, but because it had changed. It had become part of her strength, part of the way she would live. She realized that the journey was complete, not because she had finished scattering the ashes, but because she had found peace in her heart. She turned away slowly, the urn now empty, her hands light, her steps steady. The cemetery had given her closure, and she carried that gift with her as she walked back into the world. Margaret left the cemetery with a quiet sense of completion. She knew that grief would remain, but it no longer controlled her. It had become part of her story, part of the way she would teach, live, and love. The last path had shown her that sorrow could lead to healing, and healing could lead to strength. She walked into the fading light, ready for the new day that would come, carrying both memory and hope together. Chapter 8. The Light of a New Day. Margaret Allison walked out of the cemetery slowly, her steps steady but gentle, as if each one carried both the weight of sorrow and the promise of release. The urn in her hands was now empty, and for the first time since Thomas's death she felt that she was no longer carrying a burden but a memory. The air was cool, and the first light of morning began to spread across the sky. She stopped at the edge of the path and looked up. The sun was rising, its golden rays breaking through the gray clouds, painting the city with warmth. Margaret stood still, watching the light grow stronger, and she realized that this sunrise was not only the beginning of a new day. It was also the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She thought about the journey she had taken, the places she had visited, and the ashes she had scattered. Each place had carried a memory, each memory had carried pain, and each act of release had carried healing. She remembered the bridge where Thomas had painted, the sea where they had walked, the garden where children played, the mountain where she had felt strength, and the theater where joy had returned. Finally, she remembered the cemetery, where she had scattered the last of the ashes and felt completion. These places were now part of her story, part of the way she had learned to live with grief. Margaret understood that sorrow had changed her, but it had also given her strength. She was no longer the same woman she had been before Thomas's death. She was stronger, wiser, and more aware of the fragile beauty of life. Margaret held her hands together and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about Thomas, about his art, his laughter, and his love. She realized that he would always be part of her, not in body but in spirit. His lessons would remain, his presence would guide her, and his memory would live in the way she saw the world. She understood that grief was not something to escape but something to accept. It was a path, and she had walked it step by step until it had led her here, to the light of a new day. She felt peace in her heart, not because the pain was gone, but because it had been transformed. It had become part of her strength, part of the way she would continue to live. As the sun rose higher, Margaret began to walk again. The streets of Edinburgh stretched before her, familiar yet changed. She thought about her students, about the lessons she would teach, and about the life she would continue to build. She realized that moving forward did not mean forgetting Thomas. It meant carrying his memory with her, allowing it to inspire her without holding her back. She felt that she could live with both sorrow and joy, that she could honor the past while embracing the future. The sunrise reminded her that every day was a chance to begin again, to live with courage, and to find beauty even in loss. Margaret walked into the light of the new day, her heart steady, her spirit calm. She knew that grief had changed her, but she also knew that it had given her strength to live on. She carried both memory and hope, both sorrow and peace, and she understood that this balance was the true gift of love. The ashes of yesterday had been scattered, but the lessons remained. Margaret was ready to live, to teach, and to walk forward, guided by the light of a new day. Moral: grief is a path that leads to healing. Memories should not hold a person in the past, they should help them move forward. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.